James had always thought his life was steady, perhaps not extraordinary, but certainly comfortable. He had a decent job as a project manager for a local construction company, a modest yet cozy home in the suburbs, and a wife, Victoria, who had been his rock for the past 6 years. Their relationship wasn't perfect. Whose was? But James believed they had a strong foundation. They laughed together, shared inside jokes, and supported one another through the usual ups and downs of life. And then there was Tom. Tom had been James's best friend since their teenage years, the kind of friendship forged through shared adventures and the occasional reckless mistake. Tom was practically family. James often joked that Tom knew him better than he knew himself. That was why, when things started to feel off in his marriage, James naturally turned to Tom for advice. It began subtly, so much so that James initially dismissed his unease as overthinking. Victoria started spending more time away from home. At first, it was work. She had recently taken on a new position as a marketing manager at a startup, which required long hours and occasional late nights. James didn't question it. He knew how demanding new roles could be. But soon, the work excuses began to blur into vague explanations. She'd mentioned meeting a colleague for drinks or needing some time to decompress after a stressful week. James noticed the changes not just in her schedule but in her demeanor. Victoria had always been affectionate, the type to greet him with a kiss when he walked through the door or curl up next to him on the couch during movie nights. Lately, she had become distant, her once warm presence replaced by an invisible wall he couldn't quite explain. When he tried to address it, she would brush it off with a distracted smile. Smiling, "You're imagining things, James," she said one evening, her tone light but her eyes avoiding his. "Work has just been crazy. I'm sorry if I've been a little distant." James wanted to believe her. He told himself that every couple goes through phases, that the spark they had in the beginning of their marriage couldn't be expected to burn as brightly forever. Still, a quiet nagging in the back of his mind refused to be silenced. The moment he truly felt the shift came on a Saturday afternoon. Victoria had been planning to meet a friend for lunch, leaving James with the rare opportunity to relax at home. As he settled on the couch with a beer and his laptop, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Tom. "Hey, want to grab a beer later? Haven't seen you in a while." James smiled at the message. If anyone could lift his spirits, it was Tom. He quickly replied, "Sure, let's meet at the Grove around 7. Later that evening, as he and Tom sat at their usual table at the cozy neighborhood bar, James found himself opening up about the growing distance between him and Victoria. "She's been different lately," James admitted, taking a sip of his drink. "I don't know how to explain it. She's just not herself." Tom leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Different how?" James hesitated. He wasn't sure how much to say. "She's working a lot, which I get, but it's more than that. It's like she's somewhere else, even when she's home. I've asked her about it, but she keeps telling me it's all in my head." Tom nodded, his brow furrowed. "Maybe she's just stressed, man. New job, new responsibilities. It can mess with people. Have you tried planning something to take her mind off work, like a weekend getaway or something?" "That's not a bad idea," James said, his mood lifting slightly. "Maybe I've been too focused on the problem and not enough on the solution." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that, but James felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Tom was right. Maybe all Victoria needed was a reminder of the good times they shared. The following week, James booked a surprise weekend trip to a cozy cabin in the mountains, a place they had visited during the early days of their marriage. He didn't tell Victoria until the day before, hoping the spontaneity would make it feel even more special. When he revealed the surprise, Victoria's reaction was not what he had expected. "A trip? This weekend?" she said, her tone more exasperated than excited. "James, I have a ton of work to catch up on. I can't just drop everything and go." "It's just 2 days," James said, trying to keep his voice light. "I thought it might be good for us to get away, to spend some time together." Victoria sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I appreciate the thought, I really do. But this isn't the right time. Maybe next month, when things calm down at work." James nodded, masking his disappointment. "Next month," he repeated. Over the next few weeks, James began to notice other signs that something wasn't right. Victoria started guarding her phone more closely, taking it with her even when she left the room. Her excuses for being out late became increasingly vague, and she seemed to grow more irritable whenever James asked about her plans. One evening, as James sat in the living room scrolling through Netflix, Victoria walked in, her face pale and her expression tense. "James, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had always dreaded that phrase, knowing it rarely preceded anything good. "What's going on?" he asked, setting the remote down. Victoria hesitated, wringing her hands. "I've been thinking a lot lately, and I think we need to take a step back. I don't think this marriage is working anymore." James stared at her, his mind struggling to process her words. "What are you talking about? Where is this coming from?" "I've been feeling this way for a while," Victoria said, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't know how to tell you, but I can't keep pretending everything's fine. I need space, James." "Space," James repeated, his voice rising. "After 6 years you want space? Is there someone else?" Victoria's eyes widened briefly, but she quickly shook her head. "No, it's not like that. I need to figure out who I am outside of this marriage." James didn't know what to say. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. The woman he thought he knew, the life they had built together, it all suddenly felt like a lie. As Victoria walked away, leaving him alone in the living room, James sat in stunned silence. His mind raced with questions, but one thought lingered above the rest. Something was deeply, deeply wrong, and he was determined to find out what it was. The days following Victoria's announcement were a blur for James. Her words replayed in his mind over and over again. This marriage isn't working anymore. Each time he tried to make sense of it, he came up empty. How could she just walk away without any warning, without any real explanation? He had spent the past 6 years of his life building a life with her, trusting her, loving her. And now she was gone. She had moved out of the house within a week, citing her need for space and a desire to stay with a friend while she sorted out her feelings. But James couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. It wasn't just her sudden departure that gnawed at him, it was her demeanor. Victoria had always been honest and straightforward, even in their worst arguments. This time, though, her answers felt evasive, her actions calculated. She hadn't even tried to fight for their relationship, and that, more than anything, hurt James the most. If she didn't want to save their marriage, it could only mean one thing. She had already moved on. The thought made James sick to his stomach. Was there someone else? He hated himself for even considering it, but the signs were hard to ignore. Her late nights, her guarded phone, the emotional distance she had been creating for months. It all pointed to something or someone else. One evening, James sat in the now eerily quiet house and stared at Victoria's old tablet. She had left it behind when she moved out, and he had barely given it a second thought. Until now. He wasn't proud of what he was about to do. He had always respected Victoria's privacy, even when things were rocky between them. But this wasn't about invading her privacy. This was about finding the truth. The tablet wasn't password protected, and James quickly opened her email app. He told himself he was only going to look for something small, something harmless, but his hands trembled as he scrolled through the inbox. Most of the emails were mundane. Work updates, newsletters, online shopping receipts. He was about to give up when a name caught his eye. Tom. James froze. His best friend had emailed Victoria? Why? The subject line was innocuous. Dinner plans. His heart pounded as he opened the email. "Hey, Victoria." Just wanted to confirm for Friday night, 7 p.m. at the usual spot. Can't wait to see you. Let me know if James is around so we can plan accordingly. Tom. James read the email 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Plan accordingly? What did that mean? And why was Tom having dinner with Victoria without telling him? He clicked on the thread and found more messages. They had been meeting for months, sometimes under the pretense of work, sometimes for drinks, and sometimes with no explanation at all. There was nothing explicitly romantic in the emails, but the tone felt intimate. Too intimate. His stomach churned as he put the tablet down. It still wasn't definitive proof of an affair, but it was enough to leave him shaken. His 2 most trusted people, his wife and his best friend, had been seeing each other behind his back. Even if it wasn't physical, it was a betrayal. James didn't confront them immediately. Instead, he decided to dig deeper. He started paying attention to Tom's behavior, noting how often he would mention Victoria in passing, or how he would quickly change the subject whenever James brought up his marital issues. It became increasingly obvious that Tom knew more about Victoria's feelings than he had let on. A week later, James got his confirmation. Victoria had been staying with a friend, but James suspected she wasn't there as often as she claimed. One evening, he drove past Tom's apartment on a hunch. His heart sank when he saw Victoria's car parked in front of the building. She had been lying to him all along. He parked his car a few blocks away and sat there, staring at Tom's building, trying to decide what to do. Should he storm inside and confront them? Should he wait until she came out? The anger and betrayal he felt were almost unbearable, but he forced himself to stay calm. Confronting them in the heat of the moment wouldn't solve anything. He needed a plan. The next day, James called Tom and invited him out for a beer. His voice didn't betray the turmoil inside him, and Tom didn't seem to suspect anything. They met at their usual bar, just like old times, but this time, James was watching Tom closely. "So," James began casually after they had settled at their table, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about Victoria being stressed." Tom nodded, his expression sympathetic. "Yeah, man, I'm sure it's just the job. These things pass." James tilted his head, pretending to ponder his next words. "You've been a good friend through all of this. I don't know how I'd be handling it without you." "Of course," Tom said, giving him a reassuring smile. "That's what friends are for." James leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Tom's. "But there's one thing I can't figure out. How is it that you always seem to know more about Victoria's feelings than I do?" Tom froze, his smile faltering. "What do you mean?" James didn't answer immediately. He took a sip of his drink, letting the silence stretch out. "You've been spending a lot of time with her, haven't you?" Tom's face went pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I know she's been staying at your place. I know about the emails." "How long has this been going on?" Tom opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Finally, he sighed and looked down at the table. "James, it's not what you think," he said weakly. "Then tell me what it is," James demanded. Tom hesitated before finally meeting James's gaze. "It just happened, okay? We didn't plan for it, but Victoria's been unhappy for a long time, and I was there for her when you weren't. She needed someone to talk to, and—" "And what?" James interrupted, his voice rising. "You thought it was your job to step in and take my place?" Tom didn't answer. The guilt on his face said everything James needed to know. James stood up, his hands shaking. "You were supposed to be my best friend," he said, his voice low but filled with pain. "And you betrayed me." He didn't wait for Tom to respond. He left the bar and drove home, his mind racing. The betrayal felt like a knife to the heart, but now he knew the truth. The people he trusted most had been lying to him for months, and he wasn't going to let them get away with it. James barely slept that night. The confrontation with Tom played on an endless loop in his mind, his emotions cycling through disbelief, anger, and a raw, aching sadness. He had been betrayed by the two people he trusted most, his wife and his best friend. How long had this been happening? How could they do this to him? And why had neither of them had the decency to tell him the truth? The questions gnawed at him like a slow-burning fire, leaving him restless and determined to act. By morning, James had made up his mind. He needed to confront Victoria. He couldn't let her keep hiding behind lies and vague excuses. If their marriage was truly over, he deserved the truth. He texted her that morning, keeping his tone calm and neutral. "We need to talk. Can you come by the house tonight?" Victoria replied quickly. "Okay, I'll be there. Around 7. The rest of the day dragged as James tried to focus on work, but his mind was elsewhere. He replayed the email thread he had found, the way Tom had stammered through his weak excuses, the image of Victoria's car parked outside Tom's apartment. By the time the clock struck 5, James was wound tight with anticipation and dread. He got home early and tidied up the living room, not because he cared about appearances, but because he needed something to occupy his hands. When 7 p.m. rolled around, he was sitting on the couch, waiting. Right on time, Victoria walked through the front door. She looked different. There was a stiffness to her posture, a guardedness in her expression that James hadn't seen before. She glanced around the room as if searching for hidden traps, then slowly sat down on the armchair across from him. "Thanks for coming," James said, his voice carefully controlled. Victoria nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "What did you want to talk about?" James took a deep breath. He had rehearsed this moment in his head all day, but now that it was here, the words felt heavy on his tongue. "I know about you and Tom," he said, his voice steady but quiet. Victoria's reaction was immediate. Her face went pale, and her eyes widened in shock. For a brief moment, she looked like she might deny it, but then her shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. How did you find out?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It doesn't matter how," James replied, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "What matters is that you've been lying to me for months, both of you. So tell me the truth, Victoria. How long has this been going on?" Victoria hesitated, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "It's not what you think," she began, but James cut her off. Don't try to downplay this. Just tell me the truth." She looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor. "It started a few months ago," she admitted. "It wasn't planned. I was struggling with a lot of things, work, our marriage, and Tom was there for me." James let out a bitter laugh. "Of course he was. That's what best friends are for, right? To swoop in and take what isn't theirs?" "It wasn't like that," Victoria said, her voice rising defensively. "I didn't plan for this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." "Didn't want to hurt me?" James repeated, his anger finally boiling over. "You were sneaking around with my best friend, behind my back. How could you not think that would hurt me?" Victoria flinched at his tone, but didn't respond. James shook his head, his voice breaking with emotion. "I trusted you, Victoria. I trusted both of you. And this is how you repay me? By destroying everything we built together?" "I didn't destroy it alone," Victoria said, her voice trembling. "You think our marriage was perfect, but it wasn't. We stopped talking, James. We stopped connecting. I felt like I was living with a stranger." James stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. Had he been blind to her unhappiness? Had he missed the warning signs? But even if he had, it didn't excuse what she had done. "And instead of telling me how you felt, instead of giving us a chance to fix things, you turned to him," James said, his voice laced with bitterness. "You didn't even give me a chance, Victoria." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't try to defend herself. "You're right," she said softly. "I should have told you. I should have been honest. but I didn't know how, and by the time I realized what I was doing, it was too late. The room fell silent, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy in the air. James stared at her, his heart aching with a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. "So what now?" he asked finally. "Are you in love with him? Is that why you left?" Victoria hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know how I feel anymore. About him, about you, about any of this. I just know that I couldn't keep living the way we were." James let out a bitter laugh. "Well, congratulations, Victoria. You got what you wanted. You destroyed our marriage and our friendship in one fell swoop. I hope it was worth it." Victoria wiped at her eyes, her expression a mixture of guilt and pain. "I'm sorry, James. I know that doesn't mean much right now, but I am." He stood up, unable to sit there any longer. "You're right. It doesn't mean much. Not anymore." She nodded, then slowly got to her feet. "I'll let you know when the papers are ready," she said quietly. James didn't respond. He watched as she walked to the door, hesitating for a moment as if she wanted to say something else, but whatever it was, she kept it to herself. Without another word, she left, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing through the empty house. For a long time, James stood there, staring at the spot where she had been sitting. The confrontation had brought him the truth he had been searching for, but it hadn't brought him any peace. If anything, it had only deepened the wound. As the night stretched on, James found himself replaying the conversation in his mind, searching for answers to questions he hadn't even asked. How had things gotten so bad without him realizing it? Could he have done something to stop it? And now that the truth was out, what was he supposed to do next? One thing was clear: the life he had known was over. And while Victoria's betrayal had broken his heart, it had also ignited something else within him, a determination to rebuild, to move forward, and to prove to himself that he was stronger than the pain they had caused him. But first he needed to confront the other person who had betrayed him. Tom wouldn't get off so easily. James spent the days following his confrontation with Victoria feeling like he was trapped in a fog. The betrayal weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of everything he had lost: his wife, his best friend, his sense of security. It was all gone, leaving behind a gaping void. But amidst the chaos of his emotions, one thing became clear: he couldn't let this define him. He had been blindsided, yes, but he wasn't going to stay down. As the days turned into weeks, James began to take steps toward regaining control of his life. He started with practical matters, meeting with a divorce lawyer to discuss the next steps. Victoria had already agreed to an uncontested divorce, which made the legal process straightforward. But it didn't make it any less painful. Each piece of paperwork he signed felt like another nail in the coffin of their marriage, another reminder of the life they had built together, and the life she had so easily thrown away. Still, James pushed forward. He threw himself into work, picking up extra projects to keep himself busy. He reconnected with old friends, people he had drifted away from during his marriage, and found comfort in their support. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild his sense of self. But there was one thing he couldn't move past: Tom. While James had confronted Victoria and gotten the truth from her, his conversation with Tom had been left unfinished. James had walked away in anger that night at the bar, too overwhelmed to say everything he needed to. But now that some time had passed, he felt ready. He couldn't fully heal until he addressed the betrayal head-on. One evening, James called Tom and asked to meet. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Tom finally agreed. They decided to meet at the same bar where they had last spoken, a choice that felt both ironic and fitting. When James arrived, Tom was already there, nursing a beer and looking uneasy. He glanced up as James approached, his expression a mix of guilt and apprehension. "Hey," Tom said quietly as James sat down across from him. "Hey," James replied, his voice calm but firm. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, James broke the silence. "I'm not here to yell at you," he began. "I've had enough time to process what happened, and I'm not going to waste my energy on anger. But I need answers, Tom. I need to understand how you could do this to me." Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to say, man. I messed up. I messed up really badly." "That's not good enough," James said, his voice rising slightly. "You were my best friend. You were supposed to have my back, and instead you went behind it. Why, Tom? What were you thinking?" Tom hesitated, staring down at his drink. "I wasn't thinking," he admitted. "Not clearly, anyway. Victoria and it just kind of happened. She was going through a rough time, and so was I, and we leaned on each other." James shook his head in disbelief. "Leaning on each other doesn't excuse what you did. You didn't just cross a line, Tom. You obliterated it. You knew what she meant to me. You knew what our friendship meant. And you threw it all away." "I know," Tom said, his voice thick with regret. "I know I messed up, and if I could take it back, I would. But I can't. All I can do is apologize and try to make things right." James let out a bitter laugh. "Make things right? How exactly do you plan to do that? You can't undo the damage you've done." Tom looked at him, his expression pleading. "I don't expect you to forgive me, James. I don't even deserve it. But I'm sorry. For everything. And I hope one day you can move past this, even if it's without me in your life." James studied him for a long moment, searching for any sign of sincerity. Tom's regret seemed genuine, but it didn't erase what he had done. "I appreciate the apology," James said finally. "But you're right. I can't forgive you. Not yet, anyway. Maybe not ever. What you did wasn't just a mistake. It was a choice. And it cost you our friendship." Tom nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I understand." James stood up, tossing a few bills on the table to cover his drink. "Take care of yourself, Tom. I mean that. But don't expect to hear from me again." He walked out of the bar without looking back, a strange mix of sadness and relief washing over him. It wasn't the closure he had hoped for, but it was enough. In the weeks that followed, James began to feel lighter. Cutting ties with Tom and finalizing the divorce allowed him to fully focus on himself for the first time in years. He started going to therapy, something he had always been skeptical about but quickly found invaluable. Through his sessions, he began to unpack the pain of the betrayal and examine his own role in the breakdown of his marriage. It wasn't an easy process, but it was necessary. Gradually, James began to rediscover the things that made him happy. He took up running again, a hobby he had abandoned during his marriage, and found solace in the rhythm of his footsteps on the pavement. He joined a local cooking class, not because he needed to learn how to cook, but because he wanted to meet new people and try something different. One evening, while he was chopping vegetables in the class, the instructor, a cheerful woman named Claire, struck up a conversation with him. She had an easy laugh and a warm, inviting presence that put James at ease. They exchanged stories about their lives, and for the first time in a long time, James found himself smiling without effort. As weeks turned into months, James and Claire grew closer. Their connection was slow and steady, built on mutual respect and genuine interest in each other's lives. Claire knew about his past, and she didn't shy away from it. Instead, she encouraged him to be honest about his feelings and reminded him that it was okay to take things one step at a time. By the time a year had passed since Victoria's departure, James felt like a new person. He wasn't the same man he had been before the betrayal, but that was okay. He had grown, learned, and healed in ways he hadn't thought possible. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset with Claire by his side, James reflected on how far he had come. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer consumed him. He had found a new sense of purpose, a new sense of self, and, most importantly, a new sense of hope. "Thank you," he said softly, turning to Claire. She looked at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "For what?" "For reminding me that life goes on," he said, "and that it can still be good." Claire smiled, squeezing his hand. "It can be more than good, James. It can be amazing." As they sat together, watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, James realized she was right. Life could be amazing, and he was ready to embrace it.